The world is changing. We can argue if it's changing for the better or the worse, but it is actually changing. As we sit back and watch a systematic dismantling of critical infrastructure, many of us now understand the need for decentralized communications during an aggressive action from such an overwhelming force. In this video, we'll assume the internet is down. We'll assume grid power is unreliable. We'll assume the mobile phone network is inactive or overwhelmed. And we will assume getting email into or out of the area is unreliable. This is a master's class in decentralized communications. If you stick with me, I'll teach you what I know. It doesn't matter if we're talking about cryptocurrency, banking, email, social media, or the network-enabled communications we take for granted as we use them every day. As we've seen in Canada during the Freedom Convoy against mandates, a totalitarian government can and will come in to disable your banking, your communications, essential utilities, and even going as far as to silence media outlets, preventing publication of articles not supporting the narrative. Natural disasters also play havoc on our grid-tied communications. Disasters which often knock out the critical infrastructure we rely on to coordinate a civil emergency response. Immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, the government started to take action. Shortly thereafter, civilians also started to coordinate their own emergency response. We're actually seeing civilians get organized on local and regional levels. The Ukrainian people are actually coming together, coordinating on a local level the manufacture of Molotov cocktails and using unconventional communications to coordinate their distribution. Naturally, we're not only talking about Molotov cocktails. Local groups have begun coordinating a civil response, distributing water, food, heating fuel, and other necessities to areas where civilians are trapped within the fighting. Unfortunately, the Achilles heel of this coordinated effort is communication. It's not uncommon for hostile forces to target communications infrastructure. The war in Ukraine is no exception. Governmental and non-governmental organizations generally have backup plans when communications infrastructure fails. To augment its own communications infrastructure losses, the government of Ukraine reached out to Elon Musk, who promptly supplied Starlink satellite services for a continuity of government. Satellite capabilities like Starlink and satellite phones may help strategically, but they do very little for the civil response on the ground. Now, Elon Musk also brought up another point we have to take into account when deploying Starlink ground stations in Ukraine. Musk urges caution, stating, as the only source of internet in some regions, Starlink ground stations may be targeted. Users will definitely have to weigh out the risks versus benefits and see where they land. Normally at this point in the video, I would start spewing out things like ham radio this and ham radio that. Unfortunately, for safety and security concerns, amateur radio in Ukraine has been suspended for the time being. This isn't a big deal for the government since they have modern communications equipment, but can be absolutely devastating to a makeshift civilian emergency response. With the targeting of civilian communications infrastructure, radio operators may find it necessary to ignore the ban on amateur radio in an effort to save lives. If you find yourself in this situation, I do have some ideas which might help. Now, firstly, we need to understand there are different types of communications for different purposes. Traditionally, national television, national radio, local radio and television channels have been used to disseminate information from the government. These services are used to let the people know what's happening, where they should go, what they should do, or even how they can help. As infrastructure for these services are targeted and destroyed, the government uses broadcast radio and the internet, disseminating critical information to the population. Other countries also jump in to lend a hand. For example, BBC World Service is now servicing Ukraine over shortwave radio, hopefully leaving out the propaganda, but delivering critical information for the population. It's also possible that pre-recorded messages from Ukraine's own government are rebroadcasted by international shortwave and television broadcasters. Now, Czech Radio, which is the national public broadcaster of the Czech Republic, has gone above and beyond. So Czech Radio has provided surplus equipment to the Ukrainian public broadcaster, making it possible to deploy mobile broadcasting stations where their traditional stations have been occupied or destroyed. Now, on behalf of the Ukrainian public broadcasting, Czech Radio is also rebroadcasting their transmissions, providing news and information to displaced Ukrainians having fled from the war. Now, if we haven't learned anything else from our trucker friends in Canada, we should have immediately realized the radio is a way of disseminating information, which is incredibly difficult to stop or censor. Now, the problem we have in Ukraine right now is communications infrastructure is being destroyed. And even as broadcasters like Czech Radio provide surplus equipment to Ukraine, we still need to come up with safe strategies to broadcast that data. Now, we mustn't forget one of our primary goals is getting information out to the people. Since most people have an FM radio at home, it makes sense to utilize FM radio as a non-technical means of getting information out to the people. This is especially beneficial because the people are primarily listening for information. They don't need to transmit. The problem we have is FM transmitters are amongst those being targeted by hostile forces. Thankfully, though, the equipment coming from the Czech Republic is both light enough and portable enough that we take away the fixed traditional broadcasting station targets, replacing them with mobile broadcasting centers, which are much more difficult to hit. My belief is we take away the fixed target and create a moving target in regards to FM transmissions to the people. The people already know how to use an FM radio, so there's no training involved. Most people have an FM radio in their homes or in their cars, so there's no equipment to distribute. The risk is for those in the studios pre-recording the programs, and for those broadcast announcers and broadcast engineers out in the field getting the signals out there. We also have to keep in mind the idea of keeping the people informed, giving them the information they need is a critical aspect of emergency communications. Now, in the real world, that news or information isn't always that simple to find. Sometimes we actually have to look outside our own borders to find objective news and information relating to the scenario we're living through. For this reason, not only do I suggest we keep an FM radio close by, but we also keep a shortwave radio or SDR capable of receiving shortwave bands and frequencies, giving us the capability to listen to a wide spectrum of broadcasts over shortwave radio from around the globe.
This is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Praha.
Now might be a good time to start talking about group communications. We can break down our group communications into two specific types. We have the communications we use leading up to or just after a specific event. I call this first contact. We also have tactical comms for local or real-time communications once the group is together. First contact communication supports the logistics of our communications plan. The goal of first contact is to find out the status of our group members and pass along any news, information, or intelligence, helping them arrive safely at our rallying point. With first contact, we don't necessarily know where our group members are or if they're in range of our communications capabilities. Because of this, first contact needs to be the most capable, yet most flexible of our communications capabilities. First contact will encompass HF radio, VHF, and UHF radios. We could even make use of CB radio or other license-free radio systems. We will keep our focus on decentralized systems. This means avoiding repeaters, avoiding the internet, and using asynchronous data communications whenever our primary voice communications fail. In order to have an effective first contact strategy, we need to set aside the mistaken idea that a single DMR or other single band or dual band VHF UHF walkie-talkie is going to be adequate for every first contact scenario. It's not. When we don't have access to the grid or the grid is non-existent, full HF, VHF, and UHF capabilities, along with our skill and abilities to use them, will keep the signals moving. Now, when we start talking about tactical communications, we usually mean local communications in real time. One practical example of tactical communications is the way truck drivers use CB radio to warn other truck drivers of police speed traps up ahead on the highway. Other examples could be coordination of a vehicle convoy, security guards speaking over radio in a shopping mall, or police, fire, or rescue teams being coordinated over radio. In all of these examples, the people involved in tactical communications are in relative close proximity to one another. That's because tactical communications gives you the information you need right here, right now, real time. So the group has decided on the radios, it's decided on the bands and frequencies it's going to use, but now we have to communicate. Here are a few do's and don'ts of group communications. The first is keeping transmissions short. The longer our transmissions are, the easier it is for adversaries to figure out where we're transmitting from. Try to avoid transmitting or retransmitting from the same place. Just like the mobile FM broadcasting stations we talked about earlier, we want to present our adversaries with a moving target. It's also important not to transmit from your hooch or base camp. These repeated transmissions can help adversaries triangulate our positions, giving away key locations without us ever knowing it. Rotate bands and frequencies used as often as possible. Just like alternating our operating positions, we alternate the bands and frequencies we use, especially the bands, making it that much more difficult to lock in any patterns in our communications routines. Locking ourselves into a single frequency or single repeater or single systems of any kind compromise our security. Now, it's also important to use the lowest amount of power necessary to get your signal through. As we analyze a spectral representation of bands and frequencies, big signals will get flagged almost instantaneously, whereas low power signals tend to get lost in the noise. And finally, use datacomms whenever it's practical to do so. There are efficient yet obscure data modes which allow a large amount of information to be sent in seconds, where it would take minutes or longer to do so with voice. Now, there's an infinite number of do's and don'ts we could put up on the screen, but hopefully these will get us started. Now, sticking with group communications for a moment, let's talk about the most practical modes we use in this genre of communications. The two most practical are FM, or of course digital voice, as well as SSB, or single sideband. Both have pros and cons, so let's go ahead and take a look. Now, as we have this discussion, most of the time people are referring to handy talkies they use for tactical communications. Now, regardless of why we choose a specific mode, DMR, D-Star, Fusion, analog, whatever, with the exception of a few unique features, their performance is relatively similar. So FM and digital voice radios are almost always short-range line-of-sight communications for real-time voice, data, or text communications. They're primarily used on 10 meters or upper HF, VHF, and UHF and usually come in the form of handy-talkies or in some cases, mobile radios. Voice fidelity is absolutely brilliant, and with a wide bandwidth, we have potential for extremely fast data comms. Now, because of the wide bandwidth and the short wavelength, range is limited, generally speaking, to line of sight, which makes them not only short range, but very energy inefficient. The polar opposite of FM or digital voice modes is SSB or single sideband. SSB is definitely considered the more advanced method of group communications. It's generally used on HF, VHF, and UHF and can span short, intermediate, or long-range over-the-horizon communications. Where 5 to 10 watts with the handheld radio on VHF or UHF nets us a single-digit range in miles or kilometers, the same amount of power on HF running SSB will net us ranges in the hundreds or thousands of kilometers or miles reliably. We can also make use of single sideband on VHF and UHF for more efficient long-range communications and more difficult for groups with lesser capabilities to receive. To close, single sideband is extremely efficient, extremely flexible, but it requires a higher level of technical aptitude for effectiveness. And before moving on to other aspects of group communication, let's talk about encryption. Many of us in the survival and preparedness communities are talking about digital voice modes like DMR and the benefit of encryption. What many of us don't understand is, although our communications may be encrypted, it can still be detected. So take a moment to pay attention to the two radios on the right side of the screen. Those vertical streaming lines from top to bottom in the lower half of the screen are individual signals across an entire band. Now, using an SDR or an adequate radio, I can either zoom out to see the entire band or zoom in to see just part of it, or even zoom in further to look at a single signal. By listening to your signal and not being able to decode it, I already know you're not one of my people. And even though you're transmitting encrypted and I can't understand you, I can still use your signal against you to triangulate your position. Take a look at the image at the bottom of the screen on the left. In this imaginary example, I have listening stations set up around Kiev. Each of those stations has a Raspberry Pi, an SDR radio, and a Yagi antenna. By coordinating with the other receiving stations, they can figure out where that spotter is in relation to their own stations. Where the bearings of that spotter intersect from the receiving stations is the most likely place or location for the spotter. In this example, not being able to decode your communications was actually the red flag. The listening stations were able to utilize the encrypted signals against the spotter without ever making their presence known to the opposing forces. The point here is not to let your group get hung up on one specific feature from one specific type of radio. Encryption certainly does offer some benefits in terms of security, but they also give up many of the features we need for a more flexible communications plan. We don't know what we don't know, so let's get our people out in the field and give them some practical, pragmatic training to help drive in the points. Now let's discuss a few tips which are valuable from the spotter's perspective. The job of a spotter is to observe. We're simply observing what's happening in the environment, where it's happening, when it's happening, who the stakeholders are, then logging and reporting that information. It's also very important to keep oneself healthy, so we don't take any unnecessary risks. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and make the observation, then we'll make a written log of what we've observed. That written log is going to include the when, the where, the who, the what, and any context necessary to describe that observation. On our written logs, we should be sure to include diagrams of the observation. These handwritten diagrams, maps, and notes will help add additional details and context about the event after the fact. Now, when we're ready to transmit that report, we want to do so away from our hide. We want to transmit that information as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and only the information which is necessary to get the point across. Nothing more, nothing less. Remember, our job is to observe. A spotter is of no use to anyone if he or she gets themselves hurt. Now, throughout this video, we've talked about the various ways we get news and information, how we get in touch with our group, how we carry out real-time tactical communications. But what we haven't talked about is intelligence gathering. If we go back to the point I made earlier about individuals who want a certain type of radio with a very specific capability, intelligence gathering will drive that lesson home. The group needs to have HF, VHF, and UHF capabilities, not just tactical comms. Now, this doesn't mean that every member in the group needs to be equipped with DC to daylight capabilities, but it does mean some members of the group need to be tasked with listening and logging communications from the environment around us. The point here is, if we put all of our focus on tactical communications with a handy talkie that has one band, or at best 2 bands, a dual band handy, with this type of capability we'll be flying blind. We'll have no way of achieving situational awareness over the radio. With this in mind, augment our primary communications with HF capabilities. We can use an SDR, a software-defined radio, a shortwave receiver, or even an HF, VHF, UHF amateur radio to scan through the bands and log what we hear. I think the last topic we will cover in this video is data and text communications. Now, the tools we're talking about are traditionally amateur radio tools, but 2 of them can be used outside of the amateur radio bands without a license. The first one is called JS8 Call. It's a real-time station-to-station chat mode with store and forward messaging capabilities. Now, it's designed for SSB, but it'll work on any frequency you and your group decide on. There's also no internet dependency. The next one is called VarAC Chat. It's a real-time station-to-station chat mode with leave a message capabilities. VarAC Chat uses the modems from Winlink called VarAHF and VarAFM, meaning we can use them on SSB or FM modes. There's no internet dependencies and it can be used on any frequency. The next one is a radio email mode called Winlink, and it's primarily used by amateur radio operators. Now, we are changing things up a bit and suggesting the peer-to-peer Winlink and the BBS or radio-only Winlink modes. Peer-to-peer Winlink allows us to connect to any other station directly without a middleman in between. In contrast, radio-only or BBS Winlink servers are like email servers, but they only operate over the radio. Unlike Google Mail or Proton Mail, where we connect over the internet to collect our email, radio-only Winlink allows us to build a network of stations sending that email over the air to its destination. Now, we've covered an awful lot of topics in this video. To be quite honest with you, I wouldn't normally have gone outside of the amateur radio realm, but Ukraine has taught us that things aren't always so cut and dry. So take what you can from this video. I'm sure it has something for anyone who's willing to sit through it this long. A huge thanks to my YouTube members, my Patreons, and all of the other channel supporters who make this channel possible. I'm pretty sure this video is going to be demonetized, so thanks for your patience and support. We don't all have the luxury of taking 4 or 5 weeks to produce a single video, but this one was important. This one I'm hoping will save lives. With that said, guys, if you like what I'm doing, if you like the content I'm creating, please leave me a comment and or a thumbs up to let me know. And if it's not too much to ask, please share this video with someone or someplace where other operators might enjoy it. Rock and roll, guys. Thanks for watching. Ciao.
Меня, значит. Все, до 8 до 8.